Good morning. Again, I'm Marilyn Gregory. Jack and I are retired United Methodist pastors, and we've been worshiping with you since about the first of the year. We've been sneaking in at the 11 o'clock service and sneaking out again. And I'm guessing with this, my sneaking days are over. Sandra asked that I tell you how much your prayers and kindness means to her in these difficult days, and I know you'll be glad to have her back. When David emailed me the text for this Sunday, the passage from Exodus 3:16 and Joshua 3:16, he says that these two passages serve as bookends for the story of the Exodus of the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt and their entry into the promised land. So I brought my Bible so I could show you my text for this morning, beginning with Exodus chapter 3 and ending with It's going to be a long sermon. There is kind of a summary that becomes an affirmation of faith for the Hebrew people. It's found in the middle in Deuteronomy, that I want you to just hear this kind of capsule of the story of the Exodus. A wandering Aramaean was my ancestor. He went down into Egypt and lived there as an alien, few in number. And there he became a great nation, mighty and populous. When the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us by imposing hard labor on us, we cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. And the Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with a terrifying display of power and with signs and wonders, and he brought us into this place and gave us the land, a land flowing with milk and honey. This story, the story of the Exodus, is the primal narrative for the people of Israel. I say the primal narrative, I'm going to put this down. I say the primal narrative for three reasons. First, it is the most important story of the Hebrew Scriptures. It's the most important story of what we would call the Old Testament. And the second is that these events narrated in this story, encapsulated in what I just read for you, gave birth to the people of Israel, shaped the people of Israel, in the same way that the story of Jesus' birth, death, and resurrection gave birth to the Christian church and shaped who we are yet today. I call it a primal narrative for the third reason, and that is that it's kind of an archetypal story, in that it tells of the ongoing struggle between the lordship of Pharaoh and all the ways Pharaoh is still present in our world, the struggle between Pharaoh and the lordship of our God. So it is a story that reflects our own reality yet today. The story begins in Egypt, where the Hebrew people are slaves, making bricks for Pharaoh's building projects. I want to invite you to imagine the brickyard. The sun is hot. Maybe you don't have to imagine that part. The sun is hot, and the work is hard and dirty. The mud is carried from the river, the straw is gathered from the fields, the straw is stomped into the mud until you can't distinguish the straw from the mud. Bricks are shaped, laid out. Dry bricks are stacked and then moved to the places where they will be used. There are standards to be met in brick making. The bricks must be of a certain consistent size, a certain weight, a certain strength. And there are quotas as well. You understand quotas. You make 500 bricks today, and the foreman decides, well, you can make 550 tomorrow. And if you reach that, you understand quotas. And if the quality and the quantity of bricks does not satisfy the slave master, the slaves are beaten. The price for not meeting the quota is pain. There is no patience with injury or illness, no consideration for one who has worked well and long in the brickyard. The slave has no value except what he or she can bring to the work of making bricks. Walter Brueggemann says that the brickyard is a place of hopelessness. The slaves do not benefit in any way from their labor. They are not well fed because they work hard. They aren't given rest because they've done enough work. There is no prospect that things will ever change. There will never be enough bricks to meet the quota. There will never be enough profit to satisfy the regime. There is no power, no strength within the slaves to resist Egypt. And so the alternatives are, listen to this, the alternatives are to make bricks and suffer, or to refuse to make bricks and suffer more. The brickyard then and today is a place of deep fatigue, of fear, of suffering, of anger, of hopelessness. And the gods of Egypt, one place I read that there were 141 of them. All the gods of Egypt are against the slaves. All of the gods are on Pharaoh's side. In fact, Pharaoh is the son of Ra, the son of God. Pharaoh is the son of Osiris, the son of the god of the afterlife. So Pharaoh stands as a divine presence between the people of Egypt and their gods. But in that accounting, the slaves count for nothing. If they have any memory of the God of their ancestors, the God of Abraham, Jacob, Isaac, and Jacob, that memory has grown dim over 400 years. The God of their ancestors belongs to another time, another place. It seems as if the God of their ancestors has no power against the power of Pharaoh. The fact that they are Pharaoh's slaves is perfect evidence of that. Your God is nothing, as you are nothing, Pharaoh would say to them. And then, on a mountain far away, a bush catches fire and is not consumed. And a shepherd, whose sheep are grazing nearby, notices and comes close to see. And in that moment, God speaks to Moses. And God says, I see how cruelly my people are treated in Egypt. I hear their cries. I know their sufferings. And I come to bring them out of Egypt to a spacious land, a land rich and fertile. Now, we're not surprised by this story because we've heard it all of our lives. Most of us have. You may have heard it in Sunday school when you were 4, maybe 5, maybe 6 years old. There's nothing of surprise for us in this story. In this story, God acts just as we expect God to act. But in 1250 BC, this is a surprising story. In every other religion of the ancient Near East, gods are bound by geography. There's a god of Lenexa and a god of Shawnee. And if you live in Lenexa, you worship this god, and if you move to Shawnee, you just worship that god. But here is a God that is free from geography. Do you hear that? Here is a God who can speak on Mount Sinai on behalf of slaves in Egypt. In every other religion in the ancient Near East, the fortunes of the people rose and fell with the fortunes of their God. So if you wanted to know who the powerful gods were, you went to the places of power. You went to the people who had power. It was their gods who were powerful. And here's the surprise. Here is a God who chooses slaves who have no power at all. God says to Moses, I see how cruelly my people are treated in Egypt. I hear their cries. I know their sufferings. That's an important phrase. The Hebrew word for to know is yada. It can mean to perceive or discern, as I might say, I know my multiplication tables. But it also means to experience or to participate in another's experience. It is the word to describe the intimate relationship between a man and a woman in marriage. A man knows a woman. So to say, I know their suffering is very close to saying, I experience their suffering. I feel their suffering. God says, I know, I feel their suffering. In every other religion in the ancient Near East, human beings understood that they existed for the pleasure and the service of the gods. They lived in fear of their gods and their capricious behavior. They made sacrifices and worshiped in prescribed ways in order to keep the gods happy or to curry favor from the gods, maybe even in hopes of manipulating the gods. In every other religion of the ancient Near East, people suffered on behalf of the gods. And here is the surprise: this God who speaks from a bush burning on Mount Sinai, this God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, this God is free. This God suffers what God's people suffers. This God is free not only from Pharaoh's power, but from the powerlessness of the slaves. This God is free from Israel in order to be free for Israel, free to act for the good of the Hebrew slaves. This is a story rich in hope. I'm not going to try to exhaust all the meanings of the story. You wouldn't be patient for me going on that long. But there are three things that I want you to hear this morning. The first is that God still sees us and hears us and knows us. God knows our trouble, our difficulties. And God is free from us in order to be free for us, in order to act on our behalf. The second thing I want you to remember is that God did not create us for the brickyard. Rabbi Abraham Heschel says the first conference on religion and race took place in Egypt, and the main participants were Pharaoh and Moses. Moses says, "Thus saith the Lord, let my people go." And Pharaoh says, Who is the Lord that I should heed his word? I will not let them go. Heschel goes on to say the outcome of that summit meeting has not come to an end. Pharaoh is not ready to capitulate. The Exodus began, but it is far from being complete. The brickyard and its suffering still exist. It is the reality for the mother who works waiting tables 50 hours a week and doesn't take home enough to feed her children adequately. It is the reality for the teacher who has too many students and not enough books, and an administration that expects better test scores and more time spent teaching kindness and responsibility. It is reality for the one who has no work. It is the reality for the one who feels overwhelmed by their work. The brickyard is the reality for those who do not feel safe on our streets. Members of the LGBTQ community, people of color, immigrants. It is the reality for anyone who feels like their only alternatives are to make bricks and suffer, or to refuse to make bricks and suffer more. What I want you to hear from this story is that God did not make us for the brickyard. God's dream for us, God's will for us, is that spacious land, rich and fertile. Hear the promise as it comes from Leviticus. Then I will give you rains in their season, and the land shall yield its produce. Your threshing shall last to the time of vintage, and your vintage shall last to the time of sowing, and you shall eat bread to the full and live securely in your land. I will give peace to the land. You shall lie down, and no one shall make you afraid. God calls us not simply to leave the brickyard, but God calls us into this spacious land, rich and fertile, the beautiful city that we've heard sung about this morning. So, 3 words. The first, God is free from us in order to be free for us. And the second, that God did not create us for the brickyard, but for a land, a spacious land, rich and fertile. And the third, finally, God calls us as God called Moses to participate in making our community, our nation, our world a place of peace and serenity, security, and joy. A place where each family will sit under their own fig trees and their own vines, and no one shall make them afraid. Marcus Borg quotes St. Augustine. He says, "We, without God, cannot. God, without us, will not. We, without God, can't do it. God, without us, won't." The story of the Exodus begins with a call for Moses to act on behalf of God's people. And from there on, Moses is a full participant in the work. He gives his life to freeing the slaves and working with them through the 40 years in the wilderness. He gives his life for the promise that there is a land spacious and rich and fertile. He doesn't get there. He gives his life for that. And this is what I believe, that God still calls us to work for liberation and for peace and for justice. Our world certainly needs such workers. Early last Sunday morning, Omar Mateen, who I'm guessing was shaped by his own brickyard, of anger and despair. Entered a gay club in Orlando with a gun, and he killed 49 people and injured more. On the day after the massacre, Dr. Joshua Corser came back to work at the Orlando Regional Medical Center and noticed his new athletic shoes stained with blood. He took a picture of the shoes and posted it on Facebook, and this is what he wrote underneath the picture. "These are my work shoes from Saturday night. They are brand new, not even a week old. I had forgotten about them until now. On these shoes, soaked between its fibers, is the blood of 54 innocent human beings. I don't know which were straight, which were gay, which were black, which were Hispanic. What I do know is that they came to us in wave upon wave of suffering, screaming, and death. And somehow in that chaos, doctors and nurses and technicians, police and paramedics and others performed superhuman feats of compassion and care. This blood from the victims soaked through my scrubs and shoes. It will stain me forever. In these patterns of red, I will forever see their faces, and the faces of those who gave everything they had in those dark hours. There is still an enormous amount of work to be done. Some of the work will never end. And while I work, I will continue to wear these shoes. And when the last patient leaves our hospital, I will take them off, and I will keep them in my office. I want to see them in front of me every time I go to work. For on June the 12th, after the worst of humanity reared its evil head, I saw the best of humanity come fighting right back. I never want to forget that night. 3 things. God is free from us in order to be free for us. God did not create us for the brickyard, but for a spacious land, rich and fertile. And finally, God still calls us to make our world a place of peace. To what liberating work, to what peacemaking effort is God calling you?